On March 12th, 2023, the quiet streets of Vancouver, Washington were shaken by the sudden disappearance of a young mother, Mishe Melendez, and her 6-year-old daughter, Lila. It all began when Mishe's mother, deeply concerned after days of not hearing from her daughter, made a desperate call to the police. Mishe, a 27-year-old single mother, and Lila, a vibrant and loving child, had simply vanished. Mishe and her daughter were close. Mishe was a devoted mother, often seen posting videos with Lila on TikTok, where the two danced and shared their everyday lives. But now something had gone horribly wrong. Mishe's family couldn't understand why she would disappear without a word, especially since she was so dedicated to her daughter and their tight-knit family. This wasn't just an ordinary disappearance. Something darker was at play. The last known sighting of Mishe and Lila came from Kirkland Warren, Mishe's ex-boyfriend, who had a troubled and volatile history with her. Kirkland told investigators that he had been with Mishe the night before, staying at a mutual friend's apartment, and they had planned to leave early the next morning. But when they left the apartment that morning, Mishe and Lila were never seen again. Kirkland's account was the first lead in a case that would unravel a twisted history of domestic violence, criminal activity, and a story that would ultimately change the lives of the families involved forever. As the investigation began, detectives in Vancouver knew they had to act quickly to find the missing mother and daughter before it was too late. But the deeper the authorities dug into Kirkland's past, the more chilling the situation became. Was this just another troubled relationship or something far more sinister? And where were Mishe and Lila? As the investigation into Mishe and Lila's disappearance unfolded, all eyes were on Kirkland Warren, the ex-boyfriend who was the last person known to have seen them. His story about the night of March 11th, 2023, seemed too calm, too rehearsed. According to Kirkland, he and Mishe were trying to reconcile after a tumultuous and abusive relationship. He claimed they spent the night at a friend's apartment before leaving early the next morning, and that was the last time he saw them. Kirkland said he dropped them off near Mishe's car and that she and Lila had simply gone on their way. But as days passed and Mishe and Lila remained missing, investigators began to question Kirkland's version of events. His actions, especially his lack of concern, became a red flag. Kirkland's past was riddled with criminal activity. He had a history of domestic violence and violent outbursts, including a shooting incident in which Mishe had once reported him firing shots at her balcony. Though Mishe had later recanted the accusation, the police remained suspicious of Kirkland's violent tendencies. His past was not just violent, but also entangled with serious criminal activity. He had previously been arrested in Arkansas for second-degree murder, where he was accused of killing Curtis Urart, a 57-year-old man who had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. Kirkland's criminal history also involved financial crimes. In a shocking revelation, Mishe had been linked to a $220,000 theft involving a credit union, where she was seen with Kirkland's wife, Moni, on surveillance footage. The two women were connected through this criminal scheme, and Mishe's involvement raised more questions about the true nature of her relationship with Kirkland. Was this just a matter of personal betrayal, or had the couple become involved in something much darker? Kirkland's increasingly suspicious behavior made him the prime suspect in Mishe and Lila's disappearance. Investigators knew they had to dive deeper into his past to uncover the truth. But what they would discover next would send shockwaves through the entire community, revealing a much more sinister side to Kirkland Warren than anyone had initially imagined. The clock was ticking, and the police needed to know, was he hiding something even more chilling than anyone had suspected? As the days turned into a week, the search for Mishe Melendez and her 6-year-old daughter Lila intensified. Their family, heartbroken and desperate for answers, was in turmoil. Mishe was a loving mother who would never abandon her child without a word. Her mother, who had not heard from her since the 12th of March, called the Vancouver Police Department, fearing the worst. Police conducted a welfare check at Mishe's apartment, but there were no signs of either her or Lila. The apartment was eerily quiet, and no clues were left behind. Kirkland Warren, the last known person to see them, had already given his version of events, but the authorities remained suspicious of his behavior. His actions seemed detached and without urgency, despite the fact that Mishe and Lila had been missing for several days. The breakthrough came when Mishe's mother, in a frantic search for answers, discovered Mishe's car abandoned in the Van Mall neighborhood, the same area where Mishe and Lila had stayed the night before with Kirkland. This was the first solid clue that the police had in their investigation, but it raised more questions than answers. Why was the car left here, abandoned and untouched? As investigators continued their search, they learned from Kirkland that he had tried contacting Mishe after the morning she went missing. He claimed that he had called her Google Duo, but didn't worry too much about it, thinking she was just ignoring him. It wasn't until much later that he seemed to realize something was wrong. Why had he not acted sooner? Why didn't he seem more concerned about Mishe and Lila's sudden disappearance? Further complicating the case, police learned of a troubling pattern in Kirkland's behavior. Despite his lack of urgency, his criminal history, and his violent past, there was another alarming detail. Kirkland had a restraining order against him, one that was meant to keep him away from Mishe. He had already violated it multiple times, including a phone call to Mishe from jail, blaming her for his arrest and demanding she get the charges dropped. The police were growing more certain. Kirkland Warren was not just an innocent bystander in this case. His lies, his inconsistent story, and his violent tendencies made him the prime suspect. The investigation had reached a critical point. Was Kirkland responsible for the disappearance of Mishe and Lila? And if so, what had happened to them in those dark hours after they were last seen together? On March 22, 2023, the worst fears of Mishe Melendez's family were realized. The Clark County Sheriff's Office received a call from a local resident who had been walking down a rural road in Washougal, Washington. The caller described seeing what they thought were two life-size mannequins lying near an embankment by a creek. But when deputies arrived at the scene, the unsettling truth emerged. Those mannequins were not mannequins at all. The two bodies were quickly identified as Mishe Melendez and her daughter Lila. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community, but the true horror would only unfold as the details of their deaths began to surface. Both mother and child had been shot in the head at close range. Mishe had one gunshot wound, but Lila had two, leading investigators to suspect something far more chilling. Additionally, Lila had been assaulted, compounding the tragedy and horror of their final moments. As the bodies were taken in for examination, the investigators began to piece together the timeline of events. Mishe and Lila had been missing for 10 days when their bodies were discovered, and the police already had a suspect in mind: Kirkland Warren. His violent past and the troubling circumstances surrounding his relationship with Mishe made him the prime suspect from the very start. Police had already served a search warrant for his home and car, and on March 19, 2023, they arrested him for violating a no-contact order. This gave investigators the opportunity to question him further, hoping that they could unlock the truth of what had happened. But the more they probed, the more elusive the truth became. Kirkland, who had already been arrested in connection with Mishe's disappearance, remained tight-lipped about the details of the murder. In his interviews, he appeared nonchalant and dismissive. He maintained that he had no knowledge of where Mishe and Lila were and claimed that they had simply disappeared. However, evidence was mounting. Bloodstains were found in Kirkland's car, and his strange behavior made it clear to investigators that he had a dark secret he was desperate to hide. The question was no longer whether he was involved, but how far his involvement went and what kind of person he truly was. The truth about what happened to Mishe and Lila seemed almost too horrific to comprehend, but the evidence was clear. As the investigation pushed forward, Kirkland's guilt was beginning to seem inevitable. The authorities were now racing against the clock to uncover what had truly happened that fateful morning, and why Kirkland Warren had chosen to end the lives of Mishe Melendez and her innocent daughter Lila. After the discovery of Mishe Melendez and Lila's bodies, the investigation quickly zeroed in on Kirkland Warren as the prime suspect. Despite the mounting evidence and his troubling history, Kirkland continued to deny any involvement in their deaths. But the investigation was far from over, and authorities were determined to bring him to justice. On March 22, 2023, police obtained a crucial opportunity to question Kirkland again, this time with the added pressure of his previous legal troubles catching up with him. After being arrested for violating a no-contact order, detectives began pressing him about the disappearance of Mishe and Lila. They were trying to understand what happened after March 12, 2023, the last day anyone had seen Mishe and her daughter. During the intense interrogation, Kirkland initially tried to deflect, claiming that Mishe had been alive when he last saw her and that he had just dropped her off by her car, unaware that it would be the last time anyone saw them. However, the details of his story were inconsistent, and his nervousness was evident. The police had already gathered blood evidence from his car, and it was clear that the truth was closing in on him. As the questioning continued, Kirkland's demeanor shifted. he finally broke down and admitted to the murders. He confessed to shooting both Mishe and Lila. However, his version of events was as shocking as it was unbelievable. Kirkland claimed that during an argument in his car, he had been fiddling with his gun when it accidentally went off, killing Lila first. He then claimed that he was so distraught that he shot Mishe as well. His story of an accidental shooting, however, seemed highly unlikely given the circumstances. 2 gunshot wounds to Lila's head and Mishe's single gunshot wound. Despite the apparent remorse in his confession, it was clear to the investigators that Kirkland Warren had planned and carried out the murders with cold precision. He had taken steps to cover up the crime, leaving the bodies in a secluded area, attempting to hide evidence, and refusing to provide clear answers until the police had almost pieced everything together. With his confession, the case against Kirkland became undeniable. On March 24, 2023, he pled guilty to the murders of Mishe Melendez and Lila. He was sentenced to life in prison for their deaths, but the consequences didn't stop there. Kirkland's past caught up with him. In addition to the murder charges in Washington, he was also facing charges for the 2017 murder of Curtis Urard in Arkansas, a case that had been haunting him for years. His life sentence in Washington would run concurrently with the 7-year-old murder case from Arkansas, where he was also found guilty of first-degree murder. Kirkland's actions had not only robbed Mishe and Lila of their lives, but also destroyed families and forever impacted the community. Mishe's family, who had been through hell hoping for her safe return, now had to grapple with the unfathomable loss of both mother and daughter. The pain was deep, and the community that had once celebrated Mishe and Lila's vibrant lives was left in mourning. The case was a stark reminder of the dangers of domestic violence, manipulation, and unresolved criminal histories. Kirkland Warren's inability to face his past had led to the ultimate tragedy, the senseless loss of 2 lives that had so much potential ahead of them. In the end, justice was served, but the scars left behind would never heal for those who loved Mishe and Lila.